The flood that erased an empire in days. We are taught that empires crumble slowly, decaying over centuries of soft living and bureaucratic rot. But the maps of the ancient world tell a far more terrifying and abrupt story of total structural failure. The most dangerous moment for any superpower is not the season of its decline, but the precise second it achieves total, unchallenged hegemony over its known world. This is the Zenith paradox. The moment the last rival is crushed, is the moment the internal clock of the empire begins a countdown to a cataclysm that no army can stop. The following stories are not about slow fades into history, but about the terrifying sound of a world-spanning machine snapping under its own weight, while its leaders were still celebrating their greatest victories. You're about to see how the very tools used to build the greatest civilizations, irrigation, absolute monarchy, and military perfection, became the exact instruments of their overnight annihilation. By the end of this journey, you will understand why the most powerful man on Earth in 1532 could be toppled by a handful of illiterate adventurers in a single afternoon, leaving a vacuum that changed the planet forever. The real cause of the Assyrian Empire's disappearance was not the military brilliance of the Medes or the Babylonians, but the systemic exhaustion of a predatory economy that had quite literally run out of neighbors to consume. For 3 centuries, the Neo-Assyrian war machine functioned like a biological virus. It required constant expansion and the infusion of foreign loot to pay its professional core, meaning that the moment they achieved total peace through total conquest, the entire financial structure of the empire turned inward to devour itself. In the year 612 BC, Nineveh was the largest city on the planet, a glittering metropolis of parks, libraries and stone reliefs depicting the king's divine right to rule. Yet its walls were manned by a skeleton crew because the peasantry had been worked to death, or drafted into endless frontier wars. While Sin-Shah-Ishkun sat in his palace, surrounded by the accumulated wealth of the entire Near East, his supply lines were being cut not by a superior force, but by a desperate coalition of former vassals, who realized that the Assyrian giant was actually a hollow shell, held together by nothing but the memory of fear. The shock came when the Medes and Babylonians didn't just defeat the Assyrian army, they systematically dismantled the irrigation systems and diverted the rivers, turning the fertile heartland of the empire into a salt-choked wasteland in a matter of weeks. This was not a change of management, but a deliberate act of civilizational erasure that was so complete that when Xenophon passed the ruins of Nineveh only 2 centuries later, he could not even find a local who knew the name of the people who had built it. But even more baffling than a city of stone vanishing into the dust is the case of the Khmer Empire at Angkor, where the very technology that allowed them to dominate the jungle, a massive, intricate network of reservoirs and canals, became a labyrinthine trap from which there was no escape. Jayavarman VII had built a kingdom that functioned like a clockwork god, where every drop of monsoon rain was captured and recycled to feed a population of 1 million people, making Angkor the largest pre-industrial city in human history. The deeper mechanism of their fall was a phenomenon known as complexity debt, where the infrastructure required to keep the empire alive became so vast and interconnected that it lost the ability to adapt to a single variable. A shifting climate that brought 30 years of drought, followed by a season of unprecedented, violent floods. The Khmer engineers had built their system to be perfect, but perfection is brittle. When the massive silt deposits began to clog the Great Barrier and the floods broke the stone embankments, there was no plan B for 1 million people who had forgotten how to live without the machine. This was a society that had conquered nature itself, only to find that nature had simply been waiting for the system to become too complex to repair. The transition was so sudden that the royal court abandoned the city almost overnight, leaving the most sophisticated urban center on Earth to be reclaimed by the forest in a silence that lasted for 500 years. The Khmer didn't lose a war or suffer a revolution. They simply reached a level of technological mastery that was so rigid it could no longer withstand the pulse of the Earth. The most chilling detail of this collapse is found in the tree rings of the surrounding jungle, which reveal that the final, catastrophic failure of the water system happened in a single, particularly brutal monsoon season. The empire didn't just fall, it was drowned by the very water it had spent 5 centuries trying to command, proving that the more control a civilization exerts over its environment, the more spectacular its eventual reckoning will be. November 16, 1532, marks the most lopsided and improbable turning point in human history. The day the Sapa Inca, Atahualpa, walked into a trap laid by 168 Spaniards because he was so powerful he had lost the ability to perceive a threat. Atahualpa was the absolute ruler of 10 million people, a man who was considered a living sun god, and he approached the town of Cajamarca with a massive retinue of 80,000 warriors, convinced that the bearded strangers were merely a curiosity to be toyed with, and then sacrificed. The Inca's decision to enter the square with his soldiers unarmed, carrying only ceremonial batons and wearing robes of parrot feathers, was not an act of peace, but an act of supreme psychological dominance, intended to show the Spaniards that their steel and horses were irrelevant in the presence of a god. He sat upon a litter of solid gold, surrounded by the lords of the empire, and when the friar Vicente de Valverde handed him a Bible, Atahualpa held it to his ear, heard no voice, and threw it to the ground, in a gesture that effectively ended the history of the Andes. What followed was not a battle, but a slaughter that lasted exactly 33 minutes. The Spaniards used the sound of their few harquebuses, and the sight of their armored horses to create a psychological shockwave that paralyzed the 80,000 Inca warriors, who were waiting outside the walls. Because the Inca political system was a perfect vertical hierarchy, the moment Atahualpa was physically seized by Francisco Pizarro, the entire machinery of the empire, its army, its bureaucracy, its communication network, lost its independent will. The twist that nobody saw coming was that the Inca army did not fight back, even as their king was dragged away. Because in their worldview, if the sun god could be captured, then the universe itself had already ended. For the next 8 months, Atahualpa ruled his entire empire from a prison cell, commanding his subjects to fill a room 22 feet long and 17 feet wide with gold as a ransom. A task they completed with terrifying efficiency. The deeper tragedy is that the gold did not buy his freedom. It only served as a catalogue of the empire's wealth, showing the conquistadors exactly how much there was to steal once the head of the state was removed. Pizarro and his men realized that they didn't need to conquer the Inca people. They only needed to hold the switch that controlled them. And that switch was the person of the Sapa Inca himself. When the room was finally filled with the equivalent of over $500 million in modern gold, the Spaniards held a mock trial and executed Atahualpa by strangulation, an act that caused the most organized empire in the Americas to shatter into 1,000 uncoordinated pieces. The very efficiency of the Inca road system, designed to move the king's orders at lightning speed, was now used by the Spaniards to spread their smallpox and their steel to every corner of the realm. The empire fell not because it was weak but because it was too perfectly centralized. It was a body with a massive, brilliant brain and no independent nervous system, meaning that a single blow to the head resulted in total strategic paralysis. Atahualpa's capture reveals a terrifying truth. The more absolute a leader's power, the more vulnerable the entire nation becomes to a single localized catastrophe. The gold of the Inca was melted down and shipped to Europe, sparking an inflation crisis that would eventually destabilize the very Spanish Empire that had stolen it, proving that even the winners of these cataclysms are often poisoned by their own success. The most profound insight hidden in these ruins is that the Great Collapse is rarely a failure of strength but a failure of imagination. In 1709, the Swedish Empire was the terror of Northern Europe, possessing a military so disciplined and a king, Charles XII, so tactically gifted that they had spent a decade defeating coalitions of Russia, Poland and Denmark simultaneously. However, at the Battle of Poltava, this military perfection led Charles XII to believe he could ignore the fundamental laws of logistics and geography, leading his Karelian army into the heart of a Russian winter, with no supply lines and no backup plan. The Swedish collapse happened in a single afternoon because their entire national identity was invested in the idea of the decisive battle, the belief that a single, glorious stroke of violence could solve all political problems forever. When that battle was lost, Sweden didn't just lose a province, it lost its status as a superpower overnight, retreating into the borders of a minor Baltic state and never again attempting to influence the fate of the continent. The Swedish soldiers, who were considered the finest in the world, found themselves freezing to death in a foreign wasteland, not because they were outfought, but because their leaders had mistaken tactical brilliance for strategic immortality. This pattern repeats across every era. The moment a civilization believes it has found the final solution to the problem of power, whether it is the Assyrians' terror, the Khmer's waterworks, the Inca's God King, or the Swedes' military discipline, is the moment they stop looking for the cracks in their own foundation. We view these empires as ancient history, yet we live in a globalized system that is more complex, more centralized and more reliant on perfect environmental conditions than any of them ever were. The question that remains is not whether our modern systems will fail, but whether we have built enough redundancy into our world to survive the moment our own zenith is reached, and the clock starts ticking. If the most powerful empires in history can be erased by a single drought, a single captured king, or a single diverted river, what is the one invisible thread currently holding our own world together that we haven't even noticed yet? If you were Atahualpa in 1532, would you have chosen to fight the strangers immediately, or was the collapse of such a rigid system already inevitable the moment they arrived? Let's discuss the fragility of absolute power below.